Last time we began to talk about some things about developing strong Christian families. And that one thing that will help in that is if we learn to prioritize. And we looked at some things, some steps that would help us in that. That first of all, to cultivate a high level of commitment within our families. To learn to calibrate the calendar. And we looked at some things by one of our brothers, and he offered some suggestions as far as learning to take our calendar of activities and to regulate that, to regulate involvement in organized activities, to control work schedules, to develop a family philosophy regarding leisure time, and to have regular family times together. We also saw that we need to concentrate on the communication within our families, and those are some things that are significant about prioritizing, and that'll help us build stronger families. The second point that I want to cover is that we also need to plan. We need to plan if we're going to build strong Christian families. And again, I want to look at three different factors in planning. And the first one is simply this. We need to make our families places that affirm godly values. Tim mentioned in his prayer that the value system of the nation in which we live is fluctuating and it's fluid. Where are we going to be able to build a strong family value system within the families themselves? And so we need to affirm God's value system within our family. The passage that was read for us just a few moments ago from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and these words which I am commanding you today shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. What's interesting in that text is that the Hebrew language, the first word that is used for teach in verse 7 is a formal word. It is the word that would have been used of class instruction. So what it says is that parents have a responsibility to, in a formal way, give biblical, spiritual instruction to their children. We oftentimes surrender that to the church. We surrender it to the Bible school. But what Scripture said, what Moses told the Israelites, was that within the family structure, there needs to be an organization of teaching, of instruction. But then he uses another word in the second phrase when it's translated talk, and that word means the informal, more of a conversational type of teaching. So what he says is that families that are going to take spiritual truth and implant it in the next generation are going to be families where there's a formal form of instruction going on, an informal form of instruction going on as well. True story of a young boy named Timothy in the city of Dallas. The family was in dire straits. Dad had lost his job and was working just odd jobs, and little Timmy wanted a new shirt, and so he started praying for a new shirt. He asked his mom, is it okay if I pray for a new shirt? And she said, yes, let's start praying for a new shirt. Did that for several weeks. Mother got a phone call from a department store owner. He said, I don't want to inventory the size 10 shirts. Do you have anybody that could wear them? And she goes, yeah. So he brought over 12 shirts. Okay, that night, Timmy begins to pray. And he prays for the shirt. And after they're all done, Mom says, you know, Tim, you really don't need to pray for a shirt anymore. And he says, why? She says, God's answered that prayer. And she went out, and she came back in, and she set before him one shirt. And then she walked out, and she came back, and she set before him another shirt. And she made 12 trips in and out of that room until all 12 shirts were before Timothy. Now, by this time, this young man thinks God's gone into the shirt business. But what a great formal instruction. Timmy grew up believing if you ask God for something, he's going to hear you. That's the kind of instruction, that's the kind of values that we need to be teaching formally and in conversation within our families. I think also in our families, we need to be developing an appreciation for each other. You know, this world is so cruel, so harsh. Children need to know that there's a place, that they are always safe, and we need to have an appreciation level in our families that is far above that the world offers. Experts tell us that 80% of the communication that goes on within families needs to be positive. 80%. Expressing appreciation within families is significant in establishing spiritual health. The principle of building others up is a principle that's encouraged throughout Scripture. Let me just cite a couple. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Therefore, encourage one another and build one another up just as you also are doing. These Christians were troubled. And Paul says, you need to be just encouraging and lifting each other up. You've been doing it. You need to keep on doing that. Good message for families. You've been encouraging, keep it up. Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 12, but encourage one another day by day as long as it's still called today, lest one of you be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. And I know that that's not speaking about families and specifics, but the principle is so powerful. Parents, we need to be appreciating our children day by day as long as it's called today, because there's a time coming when they'll no longer be within your home and they'll be open to being deceived by sin. Our homes need to be places of deep appreciation for each other. I find it curious that even Jesus appears to have expected appreciation. You remember in Luke chapter 17 and verse 17? He heals 10 lepers. 1 returns. What does Jesus say? Were there not 10 cleansed? But the 9, where are they? Was that not saying, aren't they showing appreciation to me? 1 has. Where's the rest? Another true story. Lake Michigan. Lady Elgin began to sink. Aboard it was a young man named Edward Spencer. He was a swimmer. He was on the swim team. He began to swim the 1 mile distance from where the ship was sinking to shore, taking someone with him. He rescued single-handedly 17 people. He swam nonstop for 6 hours doing that task. It literally paralyzed him physically and emotionally for the rest of his life. On his 80th birthday, he was being interviewed by a reporter, and the reporter asked him, "What do you remember most about that day?" Anticipating there would be, the sound of the sinking ship or the screams from people that couldn't swim. And do you know what Mr. Spencer told the reporter? What I remember most is that no one said thank you. No one said thank you. Folks, our homes need to be places where we're expressing, where we're teaching the whole process of being appreciative. Spiritual households need to echo continual words of appreciation and thanks. So we need to plan to affirm godly values. We plan also to appreciate each other and to teach appreciation. And then thirdly, I think we need to plan to adapt to crisis within spiritual families. If we're going to build strong families, we need to plan to adapt to crisis. Now, the face value of that, it may sound like a pretty ridiculous thing. But I think as we explain this, it will make much more sense. A crisis is an emotional response to a hazardous situation. An emotional response to a hazardous situation. The Greek word from which crisis originates means a judgment or a decision. I think I put in the front of the bulletin that the Chinese word for crisis is made of 2 symbols. One represents danger, the other opportunity. In other words, a crisis is a judgment time. It is a time of decision that is brought on in emotional turmoil. It is a time when the emotions are strong, but it's a time when I take that strong emotion and I couple it with judgment and decision-making skills. We need to plan for those times that are going to happen in our families and in the lives of family members. So we're talking about spiritual families making plans about how they will make decisions during hazardous happenings. Some crises are developmental and predictable, like the first day of school. And every mother in this room knows what the first day of school was like for the first kid. It was an emotional crisis. And you planned probably for that. You probably came up with some way of developing a plan. I think we escorted our first one off and came back, and after Becky was done crying for a while. Now, what was really funny is Cammie came home from school, the first day of school, and she's acting like everything was just fine. Just, hey, it's just the way life is, And we said, well, what'd you do? How'd it go? And she starts rattling off things, and they took this tour of the school and went down to the gymnasium and the cafeteria, and then she goes, and then the class got lost from me. And that's exactly how she said it. The class got lost from me. She didn't wander off, the class did. And it's just a matter of fact. Well, we plan for crises that are predictable. But others are accidental. The loss of job, the loss of physical illness of some kind. Things happen, and all of a sudden, we are in an emotional hazard. What are we going to do? How are we going to react to that? Regardless of the cause, the dynamic of crisis usually follows a given pattern. People who study crises and grief and different aspects of our human nature can identify a normal pattern that we go through. And the same is true with crises. And Lloyd Aham says this: the pattern of crisis is this way. There's first of all the impact. There's the impact, the shock, the inability to process effectively. In other words, boom, this has happened and it's caught me off guard. I'm thrown off. I can't think. What in the world's going to happen? How are we going to deal with all of this shock is the initial response. And then secondly, there's withdrawal and confusion. Our normal way of responding to crisis is we are shocked. And anybody who tries to step into our period of shock and disarray and offer support is usually going to be withdrawn from. We're going to erect defenses because our emotions are in this time of turmoil. We don't want anyone to get in. And so the normal response is we withdraw from those who can support us, and what that leads to is confusion. I mean, it just builds more confusion. We are in shock. We are withdrawn, isolating ourselves. We suffer from confusion. Then we begin to adjust. We begin to adjust. Now, the amazing thing, folks, is the timetable of all this totally depends on us. We can be stuck in withdrawal, in that isolation for years in our crisis. We can just victimize ourselves for decades in a crisis. Hopefully, we learn to adjust, and the ability to process becomes reality again. And then finally, there's reconstruction and reconciliation. We begin then to build again. But that's the normal way that most of us respond to crises. Now, this is a freebie. Being a Christian doesn't change that about us. So if you've tried to help someone in a crisis and you felt rejected, know this. That's the normal process of crisis. If even a close brother or sister, someone you consider intimately close to yourself, has experienced crisis and you attempt to be the supporter, if you are attempting that at the wrong time, they don't want your support. And you will sense and feel rejection. But know this, that's the crisis, it's not the person. It's the emotional response to a hazard. It's not what that person is. If they process, there will be a time of adjustment that will come. Refusal to progress through crisis may be the strongest deterrent to strong spiritual development in our families. Folks, I thought about this one for quite a while. I referenced, I think last week, a phone call of a gentleman who was trying to find out families whose children had remained strong in the faith. And so it's something I've been thinking about for a while, just answering his question. And I truly believe that the way we respond to hazardous situations in our families is maybe one of the strongest factors in whether our kids will have faith or not. If what our children hear is our disgruntlement about the kingdom, about the people in the kingdom. There used to be a guy that would talk about people going home and having roast preacher for lunch after Sunday service. If that's what our kids hear from us about our faith, what do we think their faith is going to be? Can we become embittered and spiteful and hateful during crisis without jeopardizing the spiritual attitudes of our own children? Can we take on a negativity? Can we be controlled by bitterness? Can we become obsessed to the point that our children look at us and say, if that's having Jesus, I don't want him? Some of what happens in the nature of crisis is we search for this answer. We're moved to this why mentality. We want to have it all understood so we can make sense of it. It's that rational part of humanity that longs for that. But maybe what we can do to help us in times of crisis and help us respond more positively and not be a negative is maybe if we processed more of the what than the why. Okay, such and such has happened, and when I am through with the shock, when I have isolated myself, maybe in my isolation, maybe what I can begin to think about is what? Not why. Because if I get stuck in the why, I'm going to tend to go to the blame game. I'm going to tend to make judgments. All of that stuff's going to build. But if I change from the why to the what? What? Here's some of the kinds of whats I'm talking about. What does God expect my attitude and actions to be here? What can I do to get support and be supportive to each other? If anything can be done about this, what is it? Because a lot of times the reasons that crises take on the hazardous nature is because we don't think there's anything can be done about it. And if there's nothing we can do about it, guess what? Then there's nothing we can do about it. Consider these things. Here are some appropriate whats. What do I need to do in order to trust God's judgment and wisdom during this time? When a crisis has come, what do I need to do to put myself into the hands of God? What do I need to do to develop trust in God? James chapter 1 says, "Count it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials." Now, I just want to stop right there. Count is the King James, consider is the New American Standard. What that's talking about is a way of choosing to think. It doesn't say it's joyful when trials come. It says when trials come, you take on the ability to process. And what I want you to do is I want you to consider. I want you to count. I want you to think about the possibility that this is intended to cause some growth in you. That's one place we can go. What does God want me to learn from this crisis? Paul processed that way. Remember about his thorn in the flesh. And he says he asked God 3 times, take this away. And what did God say? Not going to do it. So Paul's conclusion was, this thorn in the flesh is here as a messenger from the evil one, and it's just intended to do what? To make me weak. And then he says, But what I've learned is that when I am weak, because I trust in God, because I say, what does God want me to do now? Because I do that, then in my weakness, I'm actually strong. So that's one of the things we can do in changing our thinking from why to what. Here's some other ones. What kind of appropriate support system is available to me and other members of my family? Rather than rejecting support, I can seek support. Now again, when I'm in full-blown crisis, there's nothing anybody's going to be able to do to probably break in. But if I begin to process and think what instead of why, then I may be able to break out. And I may say, what is there available to me to be supportive? What is there available to support my children? What is there to support my wife? Begin to process what? Again, Hebrews chapter 12. So take a new grip with your tired hands and strengthen your weak knees. Mark out a straight path for your feet so that those who are weak and lame will not fall but become strong. Process. Where's my support? Where am I going to be able to gain that kind of strength? And then walk that path. Another what? What is the environment like? What is this crisis causing me to create for atmosphere? Is it a place where emotions can be shared? Is it a place where open, honest discussion can be enjoyed? What am I doing for the environment of my crisis? I love Asaph in Psalm 73, where he talks about his own personal struggle, talks about the fact that it's feeling to him like he has kept himself pure for God to no avail. That everyone who's doing everyone that's doing evil is blessed, and he in his innocence is being punished. And he shares that with God. Now that's a pretty open environment. He processed in a very open environment. Are we working to create that kind of environment? Instead of being stuck in the why during times of crisis, what kind of environment am I creating? Is it okay to share the things, the turmoil within? And what am I willing to change or to bring healing to this hazard? You see, it's not about belief, it's about action. And see, that's why the why gets us stuck into the belief thing. I believe this is why it happened. When we change to what, then we begin to figure out what activity is going to be called for, what I'm going to be willing to do. James says that belief isn't enough. Even the demons, he says, believe. But he says, are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? We must move into activity. So what am I willing in a time of crisis? What am I willing to change? What am I willing to alter? So the two facts that we've looked at in building strong spiritual families is to prioritize and to plan. To plan, we affirm God's values, we appreciate each other, and we adapt when we encounter crises. Now, I stumbled upon this and I thought, this is just fun because it was a study done at the University of Nebraska. And not only is it fun, but it reveals how that when humanity finds truth, it comes from the source of truth. This study was done on what made strong families, and you'll find out, as I run through this real quickly, we've already preached on this from Scripture. Appreciation makes strong families. Family members gave one another compliments and sincere demonstrations of approval. They tried to make others feel appreciated and good about themselves. One of the characteristics. Secondly, the ability to deal with crisis in a positive manner. They were willing to take a bad situation, see something positive in it, and focus on that. Not the whys, but the what. They spent time together in all areas of their lives. Meals, work, recreation. They structured their schedules to spend time with each other. There was a high degree of commitment in strong families. They promoted each other's personal happiness, their welfare. They invested time and energy in each other and made family their number one priority. Good communication patterns. Families spent time talking with each other. They also listened well, showed respect. and a high degree of religious orientation. Not all belonging to an organized church, but they consider themselves highly religious. Now, to quote my father-in-law, the church is only one generation away from apostasy. You can process that, you can agree with it, disagree with it. Only one generation. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, if one generation fails to talk and to teach the things that God had commanded, if one generation fails to write them on the doorpost, if one generation fails to talk about them when they sit, when they lie down, when they rise up, then the message is lost. Just one generation away from the message being lost. The challenge to prioritize and to plan is no easy task. Everyone who has been through parenting time understands that. But it plays eternal rewards if we learn to practice the priorities and the plannings that'll bring about strong spiritual families.